Hello, and welcome to Happy Sherpa, the podcast on adaptation. Here, we meet entrepreneurs, financiers, explorers, and scientists who dare to question the world, step off the beaten track, and show us ways forward in a world that feels more uncertain every day. In today's episode, Lenny Kessler welcomes Laurent Babikian, advisor to executive committees on transition strategy and teacher at HEC Paris. I'm welcoming Laurent Babikian, someone with one of the most unusual trajectories in sustainable finance, from selling derivatives at Crédit Agricole Indosuez to entrepreneurship in Brazil, to 11 years at the Carbon Disclosure Project, helping investors align their portfolios with the 1.5-degree target. Today, Laurent advises executive committees on transition strategy and teaches at HEC Paris. Welcome, Laurent.
Thank you, Lenny, for inviting me on this podcast.
Thank you for being here. So I presented you with kind of a list of company names, but that doesn't tell much about people. What actually has driven you through this journey?
Yeah, I mean, what I can say is that I'm 57 years old and I started my career working in a bank on the financial markets, and it took me 10 years to wondering what I was doing on financial markets, because I came to the conclusion in 2000 that I wasn't creating anything. I was playing with the money of other people and the money created by central banks, and to try to make money through derivatives and other like options like swaps and all these kinds of products that are, some of them are useless and some of them are useful, but a lot of them are very, very risky. And then I decided to quit and to work with the startups, which led me to Brazil in 2008. I started again my studies when I was nearly 40 years old. I made an executive MBA. And then back from Brazil, I joined a not-for-profit organization called CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. It used to be called Carbon Disclosure Project, and which is the main environmental reporting platform in the world, where I was in touch with a lot of companies, mainly in Europe, to help them increase and improve their transparency, but also to help them fix mitigation targets. And so that's it, starting from something which is not very useful, working on money created out of thin air, to something where the notion of purpose is more important. And yes, I wanted to have a contribution to the world, to help companies in their journey to the transition. And that's it pretty much in a nutshell.
Thank you. That's a very rich journey, as I was mentioning. Maybe before we go into the deeper side of transformation, one more personal question, because I'm very sensitive to different points of view, and you have a significant experience in Brazil. How did this different geography shape your point of view, maybe on both the topic of growth, because entrepreneurs are looking for growth, obviously, but also on adaptability, because pretty often in southern countries, you are more agile.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly did this, in Brazil, they call this the jeito brasileiro, which is a way to make it happen, whatever it takes, even if there is no rule, or you just have it done. And there is a notion of when people help between themselves a lot more than like the countries from the global north. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that they are also very entrepreneurial. And I was working for an NGO there called Endeavor, which was aiming at helping young entrepreneurs in terms of sustainability. And one of the things that I could mention as an example is what the Central Bank of Brazil did probably around 2020. They created a payment system called Pix, which is a direct competitor of Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. 75% of Brazilian people use this payment system when they buy things in the supermarkets. And I think it was very well advised for them to do that, especially now that we see that those technological platforms in the US can be used as a perversion in the system, or as a way of obliging people to do things if following the American way of doing politics. And I think, by the way, that central bank in Europe should follow this example of PIX, which is very easy to use. And we should have the same system in Europe, especially now that we saw what happened with Anthropic and what happened with the judge at the International Court of Justice, who are under sanction from the US. And because they are under sanction from the US, because they put an international warrant on Benjamin Netanyahu. They just can't pay anymore with those American way of payment. And we should have sovereign way of payment in Europe. So it would be very interesting to replicate what Brazil did, and it's working very well in Brazil. So that's a way to adapt to the geopolitics of the world. And they did it very well. And we need to learn how to do that more and more.
Thank you. I remember hearing you talk about the impact of lobbies. And since we're in geopolitics, maybe coming back to a more national side or less confrontational between the blocks, but what is the role of politics when we talk about adaptation and transformation, since we sometimes feel, or let's say to be more politically correct, we're not really sure who has the power between the lobbies and the people in charge?
Well, that's an excellent question. And we have so many examples showing that the member of parliament elected by the people are not representing the best interest of the people, but they are representing the best interest of lobbies. Look at what's happening in France with la loi du plomb. We all know that pesticides, fertilizers are very bad for human health, especially now there is an explosion with the young people, lots of cancers with young people. And we should all say that we need to have another way of growing fruit without using these sources of cancer. And we don't do that. We say that there was a petition signed by 2.5 million people asking the members of parliament, we don't want la loi du plomb. And they just don't care. The guy now, the senator, which is not elected by the people, by the way, so it's maybe a bit easier for him, he's coming back in a kind of urgency law about on agriculture to try to impose this product that we don't want to have because we know it kills us and it kills our kids. So that's it. I mean, they are working for the lobbies and they are not working to represent the people who vote for them. Just this is not acceptable anymore. It has to change. I don't know how it will change, but it will be probably violent to change this. And another example is the lobby on oil. The lobby on oil is taking all the cops in hostage. And we just can't have, for example, a carbon tax in the world. We know that the carbon tax, a political carbon tax that would be accepted by the different countries, not voluntary, but as an obligation, would have a tremendous effect on the different pieces of the puzzle to help company converge to not net zero. Maybe we should stop talking about net zero or 1.5, right, to 2 degrees or to 2.5 degrees. And we just don't have this tax. And why don't we have this tax? Because there was an analysis made by an asset manager in the Netherlands called Kampen. I love this analysis. I give always this analysis in example. They ran the discounted cash flow model for all the listed companies, and they applied a $150 tax to the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 of all listed companies. So they recalculated the EBIT after tax, the net income, and so whatever, to try to calculate the cash flow and then to make the discounting work to calculate the valuation of the company. The result is very obvious, is $150 tax minus 41% on the stock market. So the oil and gas companies, they don't want this, because if you put this tax, all their scope 3 is the biggest of the markets, they would turn their profits into loss. So because of this, we don't have a carbon tax. And while we know that we need a carbon tax to solve the planet for our kids and grandkids. So it's a kind of schizophrenic way of acting. And in this instance, we are reacting to things, why we should be proactive and plan and force. And I am afraid to say that politicians or members of the parliament are not at the level of the stakes we need to resolve together in the world today. And that's super sad.
So I fully agree. It's super sad. And if we discount the politicians now, since with what you said, it seems the solution is somewhere else, but just staying on the oil consumption, you met many leaders through your role at the Carbon Disclosure Project, company leaders that, set up their target emissions on science-based initiative. Maybe 2 questions there. First, how does it work? How do you decide your target when you're a leader? But second, with your experience, how credible are these targets? It's probably the most important question.
Yeah. One of the things that made me leave CDP is, 2 things. I used to work at CDP for 11 years, so I didn't know exactly what else I could do by functions at the global level of CDP. And another reason was the lack of authenticity of those leaders who were all very excited to have a science-based target approved. And I checked before coming here, there is something like 11,000 companies now in the world who have their mitigation targets, carbon mitigation targets approved by science-based target initiative. And then in the corridor, in the backstage, they would tell you, okay, it's nice to have, I have to have this, but I will not achieve those targets. So they were not believing in this. They did that for communication matters, for CSR matters, but they were not convinced that they have to do that to save their business model and to save their survival in the long term. That's the tricky part of this. To have a target is good, but we need to change the business model. And so I was really disappointed by this behavior. Just to remind the people that to have a net zero target by the Science-Based Target Initiative means that you need to decrease between now and 2050 all your emissions, also the scope 3, by 90%. So how do you do that? If you stay in a linear world where you extract, you produce, you consume, and then you throw away, you just can't do that. So you need to innovate in terms of business model, but we will explore that later on. So that was really sad for me. And I am convinced that the companies who are doing everything they can to reach the target, because some of them will do the job, will earn the benefits of this in the long term, talking 2035, 2050 in terms of valuation, because I am convinced that it will decrease their cost of capital. But I think we're going to come back to that later on.
Yes, certainly. Maybe one little complementary question. When you mentioned these leaders didn't really believe that they could reach these targets, do you feel the majority just doesn't believe that they need to follow a target because competitive pressure is more important, or there are so many other urgencies and they can always, change later on and reinvest later on? Or do they just have too many counterpowers inside them through pressure from regulations or whatever?
The main driver of all this is the return on equity. And because you need to pay a return on equity for the pensions of all the people who are becoming older and older in the world, and you have less and less people to pay for the retirement of those people. So you need to build your own money. And to do that, it is largely assumed that on the stock market, investors require between 12 and 15% return on equity. But if you think of this, when the world is only growing at 3% a year, real growth, it's a bit complicated to have stock market valuation based on this kind of return on equity. And the stock market valuation is growing more than 3% per year. So there is a huge disconnection on the value of a company and how the cake is growing in the world. So when you need to serve this kind of objective to your shareholder, you think short term. You will do whatever you need to change things in the short term to try to improve your EBIT in the quarter. And we are talking here about a very long-term change in the way you create value in the long term. So there is a big disconnection on the time horizon of the investments. And we're talking about long-term value creation when you transition, really, in the real economy. But the market is governed by very short-term gain. We see that at a huge, beautiful piece of art, I should say, with all the AI frenziness and everything that is going on in the market with the valuation of this. And maybe we will come back to that, but we have market valuation of AI. The top 10 US companies are all around AI in one way or another. Okay. Even Tesla. I think Tesla should be number 9 right now. Those top 10 companies are worth 29 trillion. When you take the top 10 companies in Europe in terms of market valuation, stock market valuation, you have 3 trillion. So the top 10 companies in the US are worth 10 times the top 10 company in Europe. So there is a big, probably bubble. Irrational exuberance on what the AI will bring in terms of cash flow for investors. And when you are the CEO of a company and you need to produce this kind of result, then you're reacting or you're trying to optimize everything you can in the short term. And we will see that optimization leads you to planned obsolescence. So to exactly the opposite of what you should be doing to save your kids and grandkids.
Yeah, thank you for that. It reminds me, one of the reasons I left the markets years ago was when I realized that privately owned companies, I mean, family businesses, were actually outperforming in the long run, maybe not quarter per quarter, but as soon as you take a 10-year view, it's basically about 1% more every year. So that's very interesting. But without coming into that debate, that would bring us too far from our conversation. And to start digging directly into your forte, how do you see that companies could actually adapt their business models to still deliver the shareholder value, even if it's in the long term versus immediate quarterly?
So now it's the meat of the business that we're going to talk about. We were asking questions about politicians before. I am very sad, very disappointed, as I said already. And who am I to say that? I'm Laurent Babikian. I say that because I believe that. So I have the pleasure to be on your podcast. So I feel free to say that the European leaders killed the Green Deal, and that with what's happening now with the lost war in Iran and Hormuz, we noticed that we shouldn't have killed the Green Deal. And because the Green Deal was a beautiful piece of policymaking, a beautiful puzzle where all the directives and regulation were linked one to another. And CSRD, CSDDD, carbon tax at the border, 0% deforestation, SFDR, taxonomy, all these capital requirement directive, all these barbaric terminologies, but they meant something. And what they meant is that they were implying new rules of economic and financial rules, both for European companies, but for their suppliers and for the subsidiaries of non-European companies in Europe. So it was a big change of the game. And this is why it was so hardly hit at by non-European countries, especially by Trump and his administration, because they say that all this regulation is a tariff in a way, and they don't want tariff. They don't want regulation for companies. And I think that companies need to have some guidance and they need to play with regulation, because if you let company evolve without regulation, greed will be the number one thinking, explaining your decision-making process. We are seeing today with the IA, what we call now the tech lords, the lord of the technology. They try, and it's very well, in the technological republic, which is the Bible of Palantir, it's very well explained how they want to take the control of the people in the world and how they want to increase the money they make by controlling and asking the people to shut up and be the customer of what they are creating for us through the AI. And there would be a big disconnection on that. So the politicians killed the Green Deal, the one and only thing that would have changed the game. And now that Europe doesn't have any natural resources in its grounds, Europe, and just to come back to the Green Deal, the objective of the Green Deal wasn't compliance, wasn't to ask companies to respond to questionnaire. And yes, there was also this included in what was requested from the companies. But the main part of the Green Deal was to have companies starting their journey to change their business model, to be much more nature effective. And we can calculate that in terms of what we call the material productivity or the material footprint. So I don't know if I answered clearly your question.
Well, my question was trying to come down more on the corporate side and what the leaders can do, but nonetheless, your answer was very interesting. And I was also amused by the sentence that should not be out of its context, that Trump administration doesn't like tariffs, because it's not always the impression they give us.
Yeah.
Although
it's ridiculous. Yeah, absolutely.
But to come down with this context that you just explained, what does a leader of a French company or a German company today can actually do to try to make his business model nature effective, resilient? Because now they know that energy is scarce. The world is dangerous. Geopolitics are crazy. So you don't know if your market tomorrow will still be there or if your supply chain will still be there. So how as a leader can I reinvent my company?
Yeah. So that's perfectly the point where I wanted to go. So the objective of the Green Deal was to help company drive their change to increase the material productivity of the company. What's the material productivity is how much can I sell with the same stock of raw material that I need to buy to produce. And I need to increase this ratio. Okay. So in other words, I need to increase my total sales with the same level of material or critical mineral and or with less critical mineral to do more total sales or natural resources at large. So Europe doesn't have any natural resources. We need to understand that the European GDP is something like 18 trillion. So the world GDP is 115 trillion, 115. The US 30, China is 20, and Europe should be around 18, 19. So we are like 20%. But we know that to produce, we need natural resources, we need energy, and then you transform natural resources with energy to produce your product. And when you don't have these main sources that you need to buy them. So you are exposed to the volatility of the price. And we saw that with the Gulf, with Iran. The US is a net exporter of at least gas and oil. And China has some rare earth. The number one in the world, and that will be surprising for the people listening to this podcast, the number one in the world in terms of value of their natural resources is Russia. If you take into account the natural resources of Russia at the market price, they have something like 75 trillion. Number two is the US and number five is China. There is a beautiful graphic on that that we could share at some stage. So Europe needs to learn how to create a competitive advantage without having any natural resources. And this is where we can speak about new business model. Or in other words, we need in Europe to try to use the same natural resources longer in one cycle or multiple cycle of product life. And to do that, you need to change the way you sell. In fact, you don't sell products. Okay. You start selling the use of the product. And the optimization that the world went through for a couple of dozens of years led us to be very strong at planned obsolescence. Now we need to be very strong in Europe at planned sustainability and most specifically circular planned sustainability. And it's a way that allows the company when they eco-design a product and the first life cycle is over, then the company gets the product back and dismantle it and remanufacture it using mainly most of the natural resources or most of the critical material you had in the first life cycle. And you reuse something like 85%. So you can do that over a 4 or 5 life cycle, right? So that's a way to use the same materials or to use the same natural resources much longer through multiple life cycle. And so it's the opposite of planned obsolescence. But to do that, you don't sell the product, you sell the use of the product. So it has multiple advantages that probably we'll cover. I don't know if we need to cover it now, but it is a new way of envisioning the economy. You don't need to possess everything you have. There are lots of products that you can only pay for the use of the product. There you have multiple examples for that. And if you want to be very efficient in terms of nature use, we need to go through this kind of business model. And we need to incentivize this kind of business model. So if I were the States, you need, for example, to put a lower VAT tax on the people purchasing the use of the product. The VAT tax should be lower. The corporate tax on this kind of company should be lower than, for example, a company producing oil and gas. There is no reason why, if we want to reach the targets, altogether it's a collective work. I know that some people, they just want to speak about collective work or about what's going to happen for our kids and grandkids. They want to cash in the maximum today. And we have multiple examples of this in France, but it's very, very strong in the US when you have, for example, Apple share buyback in 2025 was 100 billion. So not only they pay dividend, huge dividend, but they bought 100 billion of share, 100 billion that they could have invested in terms of transition, okay, to try to smooth the dividends of the future, for example. No, they prefer to pay huge cash and to try to pump the stock price for their shareholder because they think short term. They probably know that something bad is coming, but it's not that much of their interest. And that's very selfish. It's a moral question in the end. You were talking before about the CEOs. Good management in the company is to maximize, for me, the value creation in the long term, not in the short term. So if you have this in terms of objective, then you make different decision making, right? Potentially opposite decision making than the one that you're doing to maximize the short term gain.
Maybe if I may, I think there's another dimension to circularity that I hear through what you're saying. On these circular models, very often it means new partnerships, new relationships, long-term relationship with your customer, because if he's buying usage, you're going to speak to him regularly. So not only is there this dimension of short-term versus long-term on I'm working for my long-term shareholder, but I'm actually working for many more parties inside and outside my company. And it almost rings a bell with what you were mentioning about Brazil, where people helped each other a lot more. Is this a dimension that you see as, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, this kind of new economics is a way to do more local things. So you build another interaction in the territory, in the local circle where you are. And because when you rent the use of a product, you have a performance contract, right? So you need to be close to your client. So if there is a problem, then you need to make some maintenance, or when the product arrives at the end of life, then you need to get back the product, to dismantle the product, and then to remanufacture the product. All this is happening locally. So it creates job locally. It's an excellent tool for industrial sovereignty. Okay. It's an excellent tool for increasing the margins, because it's when you do that, it happens that you do less volume, but you increase your margin. It's an excellent way to liberate, to free purchasing power. Okay. Because if you don't buy a good, you only rent the good, so you pay less. And if you pay less, you can have access maybe to other use of other product that you could never have bought. So maybe you will be able to pay for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months use of another service that you never had. You were never able to buy should you have to buy it. It's an excellent tool to mitigate inflation, because exactly as we said, in Europe, we are very reliant and dependent on importing natural resources because we don't have, and it's very volatile. And I think my guess is that from now on, you will have more and more geopolitical trouble. Because in fact, I think what's at play, we haven't discussed this, but I'm going to use this opportunity to discuss this now, is there is a shift in the balance of power between the G7 and the BRICS. And it happened in 2022. Okay, now 50% of the world GDP comes from Asia in terms of purchasing power parity. 50%. The number one country, the number one GDP in terms of purchasing power parity is China, like much ahead of the US. And number 3, it's India. And a lot of the natural resources are in these countries, in the BRICS. Russia, as I said before, is the number one. So when you take all in the purchasing power parity GDP of the world, the balance of power shift already occurred. And on the top of that, if you add all the natural resources, oil, gas, uranium, timber, all this rare earth, it's mostly in those BRICS countries. And we saw very well that China wanted to stop exporting rare earth to the US. The rare earth, you have rare earth metal in technology, in data center, in weapons, in rockets. In the high tech, you need a lot of rare earth metal, and they threaten the US to stop exporting. So it's a game now where we can see very well that the US sanction on the world are less and less effective. By the way, China just announced that whatever they want, if they want to sanction Chinese company, they ask Chinese company to bypass this sanction, because if the Chinese company undergo this sanction, then the Chinese government would go and track them with trials, because it was counteracting with their legal principle. And So we can clearly see now that with the fact that the BRICS country are trying, and it's the case. In the global trade, the dollar is less and less used. I mean, it's still very prominent, but the share of the dollar in the global trade or in the central bank reserves is decreasing. Okay, and the less it decreases, the less effective is the sanction of the US. And we saw that with Venezuela. So Venezuela is the largest oil reserves in the world. They were selling oil to China in yuan, okay, not in dollar. So the US say, okay, we're going to overtake the government and we're going to own the natural resources of Venezuela and we're going to sell the oil of Venezuela in dollar. That's petrodollar, basically. And we see now in the Gulf, in Iran and in the Gulf states, the Arabic states, we see that probably the petrodollar era is dead. The deal since 1973 was that the US would bring the protection to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all those countries, only if those countries were selling their oil in dollar. So they were selling their oil in dollar, and then they were investing this dollar to finance the US debt. It was a perfect cycle. The US was very happy, and those countries in the Arabic states were very happy because they thought that the US would protect them. They just saw with what happened with Iran and this Iran-Israel war that it wasn't the case. And when they had to make a choice, they favored Israel versus Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar. And it created a lot of turmoil there. And this is why I am saying that I think it's the end of the petrodollar era. So that was something that I wanted to say, but I lost track of what was the second point.
We were on the adaptation of business models here, and we went on this track because of the lack of natural resources in Europe.
Yeah.
And so we're dependent.
Yeah.
And then we understand that the global south is now basically becoming stronger and stronger by the day. Maybe a bit with my words, but the abuse of power has made everybody divert slowly. Dollar is still there, but it's a shrinking share of the world trade. So with that, if we want to rebuild our sovereign strength, we need this circular sustainability you were mentioning. Yeah. So all of our businesses should start thinking about, how do I reuse the raw material I already have?
Yeah, I have it. Yeah, so I'm going to complete that. So we are very dependent on these natural resources. So we are very dependent on the imported inflation. So a very good way to absorb this inflation is to buy the natural resources and to make it last a very long time. So in a multiple cycle, as I said before, circular, planned sustainability, because you will not have to buy every 4 or 5 years. In a normal cycle of planned obsolescence, every 4 or 5 years, you go and you buy a new product, which has requested new raw material. And we are extracting, by the way, 110 billion tons of raw material. So it can be oil and gas, biomass, metals, rare earth, whatever. And only 7% of this is either recycled, and even if it's recycled, not really, or reused. So it means that 93% is lost. We just can't bear that. We cannot support that anymore, right? Because we can't deplete all those resources. And the other thing is that now to get the same yield in terms of extraction, you need to go deeper and deeper in your mine, which is costing money. And if you want to create a new mine, you need 15 years. So we don't have time to do that. The demand for copper, I think, is going to increase by 3.5 times by 2040. And we have the figures on that. So we will not be able to respond on time to this demand. So we need to use these natural resources in a way that make them last much longer. And this is absorbing inflation. Okay. And we know that we're going to have inflation. We know that climate change is inflationary by essence. So on the other side, people say that IA will save us all and it's going to decrease inflation. But the question is, who will win? Will we have a net result of higher inflation, or will we have a net result of lower inflation? But in any case, in Europe, we don't have all these things, and we need to be clever and to reinvent our models.
Which brings me maybe to a point you touched on very briefly earlier of accounting.
Yeah, that's good. Let's do that. When a company is producing a product and does not sell the product but only sells the use of the product, it means that the company remain the owner of the product. So the company will put this product into its fixed asset, especially if you create with the same material, as we say, multiple life product cycle, then you will embed into your balance sheet in fixed assets this product. What is being done now, what is allowed in France now, in terms of accounting principle, is that you can, if you have products in fixed assets, you can amortize not the product, but you can amortize the components of the product. So, for example, the natural resources embedded into these products. But you can only amortize up to the first life cycle. So if the first life cycle is 4 or 5 years, after 5 years, you amortize and the value of this product in your balance sheet or in your profit and loss account is zero. So when you have this happening, it does not incentivize you. When you have something worth zero, it does not incentivize you to be sustainable. It incentivizes you to recreate another goods and to resell it. That's the system. It is flawed. We need to change this. So what we are asking now to the National Authority of Accounting in France, we are asking that when a company is in this kind of business model, they produce and they sell the use of the product, then they should be allowed to amortize the components of the goods. So basically the critical minerals or the natural resources integrated in the goods throughout all the life cycle it enables you to produce. So if it's 4 life cycle or 5 life, then it's 5 life cycle of 4 years. It would be 20 years. If you do that, you decrease your provision for amortization, right? And you need to take this when you calculate your manufacturing costs. You calculate all the costs to produce a product, you integrate the cost of the amortization. So if you have a very low cost of amortization, it decreases the manufacturing costs, and you can either increase your margin if you stay at the same price of the use of the product every month, or you can even decrease the price to be a bit more competitive. So it's very profitable. But to do that, you need to have this accounting principle enabling you to do that. The other thing is that some of the material we're talking about, for example, the copper, the physical characteristic of the copper, it's always the same throughout the years. It can last 100 years, 200 years, right? So we are asking the Autorité des normes comptables to enable company when they are in this kind of economy to put into fixed asset those material and not to amortize them. A bit like land, a piece of land. When a company buys a piece of land, it gets in the balance sheet and you never amortize a piece of land. It would be the same thing. And if you do that, you reinforce the quality of the balance sheet. So it's good for the banker trying to finance this company, and you can get better rates of financing if you have an improved quality of balance sheet. So that's the accounting principle I wanted to insist on. And we are working on that with a group of people in France to try to make this happen.
And coming back to our previous discussion, what I think is great, obviously companies will be able to finance themselves more easily, etc. But it's also something that's in our control today. Knowing where AI will be 5 years from now, nobody really knows. So the effect on inflation is up or down, as you were mentioning. But this we know we can do.
Yeah.
So it's circle of control.
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah. But still, it seems pretty obvious, but still, you need to convince a lot of people, and especially the politicians, where we also have some discussion, and they say, because we were discussing with them and say, okay, there is no reason why a company producing electric scooter, for example, today only one company called Mobion would pay the same corporate tax than Total, or another company that is renting sports material called Swoop, a new company. Also this kind of circularity economy where they rent sport material for the same price and you can have a mix of different products to choose. And there is no reason why those companies that are trying to decrease their material footprints, again, I'm not talking anymore about carbon footprint, I'm talking mainly about material footprint, and to try to increase their material productivity, which is total sales divided by the quantity of natural resources you need to produce it, times the life cycle. I presented that this morning. I made a presentation this morning online for some consultants on that. They should pay the same tax no reason. But then the politicians say, okay, we have a problem of earnings. We need to finance the deficit. We just need to find money. So if you decrease here, we need to increase here, but we need to be sure that the net is the same level. We cannot ensure that, right? But still, we need to incentivize those people to do the right things, because if the tax system does not help, it will take much longer. So you have accounting principle to change. We believe that we're going to be able to do that, and we're working on that. You have financing principle to change. I'm going to discuss that. And you have taxation principle to change. Financing principle to change. Why? Because we believe that, and we had some discussion with some banks, and some of the banks are in the room. Today, banks finance either companies or goods. On va dire ça comme ça. Hein. So banks finance company, okay? They lend money to company, or they lend money to goods when they make leasing. Okay. Now we are asking banks, if a company use the same raw material in multiple life cycle, then envision your loan to this company, not as a loan to the company, but as a loan to the goods you're financing, not over 4 years, but over 20 years, which is the maximum length of the total life cycle this material enable you to produce. And so in fact, the bank would finance an infrastructure of raw material, so to speak. And so it's increasing the duration of your loan. And I know that since 2008, the average duration of the loan is going down. Now we are asking the banks, for this kind of economy, if you want to help this economy to emerge, you need to envision your loan as a financing of material. And we are trying to create an asset class for that, a sustainable asset class for that, because we know that if you have an asset class, the banks, it's much easier for the bank to finance. Exactly like crypto became an asset class, we will have sustainable asset class probably in the short term. So banks would finance this sustainable asset class over the long term, and it would help companies receiving this money to decrease the reimbursements every month. So it will also help the company to decrease manufacturing costs a bit more than what's enabled you the accounting principle we discussed just before.
Thank you. That's really interesting and thorough. Maybe just one word for our listeners, because you mentioned Mobion, and we actually had the pleasure of having Christian Bruyère a few episodes back. So the episode is available. Just moving to another topic we mentioned during the preparation, and is linked to this, variability in tax rates, but there was also the variability in pricing. So the sustainability linked pricing model.
I love it. Thank you, Lenny. I think a world of fixed prices is dead. Okay. All the prices, central bank money, prices when you buy a car, prices when you pay electricity. I think this is dead, because I think that I am a bit optimistic when I say that, right? But that's my conviction. If you want to solve the problem we are trying to solve collectively together, we need to start the implementation of sustainability linked pricing. And in fact, it already exists. And what is a sustainability linked pricing? It's a pricing that is viable versus some KPIs for each of the stakeholder of the company. So if you take your supplier, you will buy at a higher cost, a higher price from a supplier that is doing good for you, basically that is enabling you to decrease, for example, your carbon footprint, or to decrease your material footprint. You will pay more. And the supplier that does not take this into account, you will buy at a lower price, so that it incentivizes the supplier to keep working with you. And he knows that if he wants to work with you and have more money, then he needs to do goods, right? But the same way goes to the customer of the company. If you take only the carbon footprint, because it's more easy to illustrate than the material footprint, in the scope 3 way of calculating the scope 3 of a company, you have 15 subcategories. You have 2 main categories in the scope 3. The scope 3 coming from the supplier. So the emissions linked to the supplier working with you, and the emissions linked to you selling your product to your client. Use of product sold. So if my client I sell my product to enables me to decrease my scope 3 with this client, then I have to sell to this client at a lower price. If it does the contrary, then I will sell to this client at a higher price. The same way goes with the bank. And we have this tool called sustainability linked loans, but it's very small and it should be a vanilla product now on the market. It is not, probably because the bank doesn't earn so much money with this, because when sometimes they get more money, sometimes they get less money. What's that is that the bank lends you money and the interest rate that the company pays to the bank is linked to the achievement of some KPIs. So it can be, for example, the decrease of your carbon emissions by X% per year. So every year you analyze and you have this audited by a third party and you say, okay, this year I decreased by 5%. Okay, good. I'm going to pay to the bank minus 0.3% compared to the normal loan without any conditions. But if 1 year the company does not do this level and it increase, for example, the emissions, then the company will pay plus 0.3 compared to the vanilla product. So that's already exists. And the other thing, the other stakeholder, the two other stakeholder is the states. That's where we discuss about the taxation. There is no reason why the corporate tax of somebody is doing good for the kids and the grandkids pay the same amount of corporate tax than somebody who is super polluting the planet and because of the lobby is killing people or is bringing cancers or whatever. And the last stakeholder is the employee. And you have this de facto in the pricing because you have the fixed salary and you have the variable part, you have the bonus and all this. It's already there. So this is why I'm saying that now each company to survive and to try to reach the targets, the company needs to implement sustainability linked pricing with each of the stakeholder of the company.
What I think is really interesting is that you're, at least in the way I understand it, are closing the loop also with, let's say, carbon taxation, to make it simple. As you mentioned at the beginning, it's still not there and there's still a lot of difficulties to set it up, mainly political difficulties. But once you have this taxation, it becomes very evident that you don't want it in your product in your scope 3. So then you will have this differential pricing even more easily. Yeah.
Of course.
So,
of course, and and usually the argumentation we use for also to fight the taxation is that we say, okay, if there is a carbon tax, I'm going to pass on the cost of the carbon tax to the clients. But why is that? Because you need to keep your 15% return on equity. You never question the decrease of the return on equity. In all the equations, this is becoming constant. Every other thing can change and decrease or what, but this one has to stay constant. This is not sustainable anymore. We know that and we see that's happening. So you could say that if there is a carbon tax, you will keep some of it and it will lower your margin. You will be able to pass on some of the cost to your clients, but don't forget that your clients, in average, in the world, they are losing purchasing power year after year. That this is not me talking. These are figures from OECD and it's very well documented. And we will go in the future, AI will decrease the price, climate change will increase the price. So in net, I don't know what will be the answer, but there is a highly risk that this purchasing power decreasing will only accelerate over time. So if my clients have less purchasing power, they will be less and less keen to buy products which are becoming more expensive because I want to pass on the carbon tax that the government asked me to introduce. So they will, at one stage, have to absorb part of this tax. This is why I'm saying that the climate change is going to decrease the return on equity of the company, whether you like it or not.
Thank you. I'd like to change the angle a little bit because in this podcast, we are always very interested in the impact of change on individual people.
Yeah.
And everything we went through and the different business models that can actually bring cost down, but usage up for the same raw material, etc. I feel it should make people optimistic. I mean, it sounds like a very positive change if I know I'll have a car and drive and not have to buy it when it breaks or whatever. Is it possible that it brings more optimism in your sense?
That's a very good question, Lenny. Thanks for asking.
So maybe sorry, go ahead.
I mean, part of the community is trying to sell the idea that we need to change the narrative, okay? So that the people buys the concept of having less or paying less or having not having everything you want because it's going to improve the conditions of life for your kids and grandkids. And so it's all about question of changing the narrative. and make desirable things that were not until now desirable. So make, for example, you don't need to own all the goods you use. You can only own part of the goods, and some of the goods you have to rent the use of them. So yes, for some people, it's joyful, and it's another way of looking at things. But we are 8 billion people on Earth. And don't forget that all those global South countries, they tell us, and that's the geopolitics of climate. Hey guys, you made a lot of money on our natural resources. You created industry, you created everything. You became very rich. You have one fridge, 2 cars. Now we want to have a bit of this. So shut the fuck up. I don't know if we are allowed to say that, but you should decrease much more your emissions in the global North countries to enable us to try to get closer to the standard of living that you have. So for those people, I don't know if, it's joyful. They probably want to experiment the possession cycle. But what I think is that, and it's a discussion we had together, probably it will bring some freedom to the consumers who are acting like this, because they will also have access to other use that they couldn't have access until now if they only pay for the use of the product. At a moment where those people have less and less freedom, we see very well that governments are trying to control us more and more and give us less and less individual freedom. Through the checks now, they want to check the under below 16 years old. In the UK, they announced that they closed the below 16 years, the access to the social network. And it's a way to control also, because to do that, you need to register to have your digital ID. So you will need to see who's below 16, who's not below 16. So I think that under these false reasons, it's a way to control the population. But we see clearly that we have less and less the right. I mean, when you see that when people are demonstrating in a show of solidarity, for example, for Gaza, and they are not allowed to, they can be put in jail for that. When you just breathe 5 minutes, you breathe in, breathe out 3 times, try to connect yourself to the cosmos and say, what's going on? They are trying to tell you that this is normal. This is just not acceptable. If I want to show solidarity for some people because I believe that what's happening for those people is just insane, I need to have the right to do that. So we see that everywhere, here and there, you have less and less freedom. And while for the companies, it's the opposite. And that's not acceptable. For the companies, everything is made to deregulate everything so that they can do whatever they want, do as much profit as they want, try to abuse the workers, try to abuse a lot of dominant situation. If you are a monopoly, for example, like all the big tech in the US, they are all monopoles, and they don't want to have rules. This is one of the explanations why the Green Deal was shut off. They people say there are too many rules. And so for the companies, you increase the freedom, and for the people, you decrease the freedom. That's not acceptable in our world today. And I believe that it will end badly.
So thank you for this honest answer. I was trying to bring back the happy in our Happy Sherpa podcast, but maybe going a little bit further down your line.
Just, can I answer? Okay.
Sure.
For the Happy Sherpa, I think that for the people who are going to live in this world of I don't possess and I pay for the use, and so there is a change of world. So all those people will be happy. The question, because they are convinced, the question is, this is what I was saying, we need to convince other people. This is where there is a change of narrative. But I think one thing is sure is that the less you are attached to material, the freer you are, the more freedom you get. Probably that all these changes will drive us to the notion where you need to feel less attached to the material goods and to be driven by the notion of you share and you have empathy, and where you have maybe less rationality and more emotional things that can be expressed. And I think that this will drive us to do this. But for sure, if I am driven by how much do I possess and how much do I earn and what is my potential in society, I am always comparing myself to benchmark. And this is not driving you toward the freedom of consciousness, so to speak. So
Thank you. You're actually answering the question I was about to ask. There's a subversive side to this movement of creating slightly more freedom on the margin, even if the system is trying to be very rigid in the name of security, maybe post 9/11 or whatever. And so now I feel that through just giving access to things that I could not afford, through this increasing relationships and partnerships, because you need to build the relations through locally, exactly, through even the shared pricing, that means I constantly have an incentive to think about the commons and not just my individual immediate gain.
Yeah.
I think all this is very subversive in a sense, but it's also a movement that can be very joyful and bring a lot of energy to build something on the side.
Yeah, I agree with that. And this is the next version of capitalism. We clearly see today, I just wanted to mention something when you were talking. I had some thoughts about security. We say that because we want to increase the security of the people, then we have to decrease their freedom. That's bullshit. But what about companies? Companies, you're increasing their freedom and they are not increasing my security. On the contrary, some of the companies are killing me. No, if you take pesticides and all this stuff, we know very well that some of the companies are killing me. So where is the security they bring? There is no security for those companies. And on the contrary, they are lethal company. If you take Palantir, it's a lethal company, right? If you take the AI company, they probably are going to be a player for the sake of security, but it's not what's going to happen. And I wanted also to say something, I don't know, you will see if you cut to it or not, about the AI company. The AI company, we are living now a massive extortion worldwide because all these AI companies that are valued at trillions on the stock market are basically stealing the global knowledge, the global arts, and the global research and fundamental research that all the humanity has produced so far. And they take it for granted. They don't pay anything to anybody. And then they train their LLM models and so on. And then they monetize this to make money. So this is not acceptable. This is a huge robbery. So one of the ways to respond to this robbery is that the government becomes shareholder of those companies. This is what in the US they want to do. They want to become shareholder of ChatGPT or Anthropic or potentially SpaceX because they say that it's going to compensate for what the American brought to the system. And what about all the other people in the world who are not American? If the US government is becoming a shareholder, the other people will not be able to benefit. This is profoundly unjust and this has to be corrected. But to come back to the security, yeah, the company, I mean, fine, if you give more freedom to the company, fine, then give him more security. But it's absolutely not what they are doing. They are doing the opposite. So they are earning to each front. This is not acceptable anymore.
Thank you. So we'll try to find joy elsewhere.
No, man, we will have joy. What I was saying is that it's the end of the neoliberal version of capitalism that we are experiencing right now. And the arrival of new world is being in construction, is being built right now. This is why it's so shaky. It's so chaotic because we clearly see that it's the end of neoliberalism for all the reasons we discussed. But for also one reason is that you have, for example, companies making predation of natural resources of other companies. They make war for that and they predate. So it means that the market is not flowing, is not acting in the way it should be acting. When the US wants to go to Greenland to take what they have below their ground, it's or to go to the Venezuela to take the oil. This is the end of a cycle and the new cycle is coming and it will be more. We have to detach ourselves from the idea of possessing things. So it will have some joyful effect. Yes, I don't know if it's going to be the paradise. Welcome, my friend. I think it's good and you can do whatever you want. But it will be probably much more interesting than what we are experiencing right now.
Thank you. Maybe one last question, because this sounded like a perfect conclusion. Would you have a recommendation for our listeners as a first step into action to actually be part of this new world that can be created?
What I think is young people today, we know that they will suffer more than we did because of climate change, potentially because of AI. I don't know the result of AI. Okay. If you don't work, you are paid, you receive a universal salary every month and you can do whatever you want. Maybe I don't buy all this, but we don't know. We will see. And they will have less and less money because another drawback of the system is that the generation now, the 20 years, 30 years old young people now, is the first generation in the history of capitalism that is going to receive less purchasing power than their parents. That's a fact. McKinsey made a study on this. So they will have climate change, less money, price of housing exploding and everything. Maybe AI, we don't know. So they need a way to envision things differently, because if they don't envision things differently, it would be super problematic for them. So you can spend your time on the screens and put your life on the screens and try to dream of something else. Or you can start acting differently, trying to change the system by proposing new things, such as the one we were discussing during this podcast. And to do this, okay, to change this economic model doesn't mean that you will lose money. That's something fundamental that I want to say, is that the people who are going to join this movement of economy of functionality, circular economy, circular planned sustainability, these new kinds of business model will make money. That's very important to mention. They will make money so that they can use this money to do whatever they want to do. And they will want to travel. I am not from those people saying that you cannot travel anymore and you need to decrease your travel. But if you are young, you need to know a bit what's going on in the world. So you need to travel much less, but maybe once every 5 years instead of once a year before. I don't know. But they will earn money by changing this business model. And so that they will be used to use that. If maybe they will need less money in the future, because of the change that we saw, this kind of economy means that you have a liberation of purchasing power. I don't know, you cannot be certain of things, but they don't do that for free, right? So this new economy is an economy, so it has to survive and it has to make money. So that's one thing. The other thing, what should I recommend? If they study, they need to take into their elective during the studies, be they engineer or business school or I don't know, psychology or history of art. They need to take elective around this kind of new economy. How do we build a new economy together where we share more and we are more interconnected? Yeah, that's it. And to read also, to read and to meditate deeply and to read some very good book. But we will.
A recommendation?
One obvious recommendation for me, it's not linked to economics. It's The Power of, because it's very enlightening in terms of access to consciousness and in terms of access to the here and now. We need to, and also for the young people, I would recommend that we need to live here and now. We don't live in the future. The future will not be much better necessarily than today. And usually when we think of the past, it's always for suffering. And the only thing we are certain of is the time we spend right now together. So spend most of your time here and now. That would be, and if you want to have some guidance, you should read the book, The Power of Now.
Thank you, Laurent. That's a great last word. I'm not going to ask more questions on here and now because I know it would be a whole new episode, but it was great to be here and now with you. So thank you very much.
Me too, shared pleasure, and thanks for the invite.